So, without further ado, I will introduce our program and speaker for this evening. Our topic is fate, destiny, and choice. All very substantive words. Our speaker is a Jungian analyst who was trained in Zurich. He studied with some of the biggies in Jungian circles, Marie-Louise von Franz, Barbara Hanna, and Arnie Mindell. His interests focus on alchemy, dream work, and active imagination. And we're especially privileged that he is a co-founder of what is now the C.G. Jung Institute of Colorado and is their current president. He has published 4 books and several articles that are the books. I don't know if they're all available, but some of them are available for purchase out here in the lobby during intermission if you're interested. He is currently, he has served as an adjunct professor at the Pacifica Graduate Institute. He's an internationally respected analyst, author, and teacher who at the moment is particularly enjoying his 3 grandchildren as he ponders the prospect of growing old and the relationship of aging to individuation. So if you please would join me in welcoming Jeff Rath. Jeff?
Thank you. Thanks. That was quite a build-up, so I hope I don't disappoint anybody. Can you hear me okay? Good. I didn't know that I would be giving this talk to you all in Boulder at a time when fate has been particularly noticeable in the last couple of weeks. Keep that in mind because it's a good example of what I mean by fate. So what I'd like to do tonight is talk about fate and destiny. I use the word choice. You could also use the word free will. When you're discussing topics like destiny and fate, the question of free will becomes very important and interesting. So what I want to start out by doing is kind of differentiating and defining what I mean by fate and destiny. It's not necessarily what everybody means by it. I've taken the terms and kind of used them the way that made most sense to me. I want to talk about those, and I want to try and amplify some of their meaning by using symbolism. I'm going to talk about alchemy a little bit. I'm going to talk about some of my own dreams, which touched on the subject, and other traditions that really interested Jung and have a lot of bearing on the topics that we're going to be talking about tonight. In terms of process and procedure, this room is very comfortable, I think. It's a very nice, intimate kind of space. So what I'd like to do is talk at you for a little bit, and when we'll take a break around 8-ish for about 10 minutes, and then invite you back to ask any questions that you might have. If during the course of this I lose you, don't wait till 8 o'clock. Just, say, could you explain what you're talking about one more time? So I don't want to lose everybody by 8 o'clock and then spend an hour or something trying to get you back on board. As I use the term, fate is grounded in time and space. And destiny, which is closely related to fate, is also related to time and space, but it's not bound by time and space. That's going to be an important distinction. Fate is what's happening to you in your world at this particular moment, or has happened to you in your lifetime in the past, or will happen to you in your lifetime in the future. Destiny has a feeling to it that transcends time and space. There's a feeling to it kind of akin to what Zen Buddhists call your original faith, something that is not necessarily determined by your experiences in time and space. So fate would include, for example, the historical context into which you were born. This would include family, country, culture, and in particular the historical period in which you were born. The main characteristic of fate, as I think you'll all be able to relate to, is it's totally out of our control. We simply have no way of controlling what life is going to bring us. I mean, there's some things we can do. We can take care of ourselves so we don't get sick. We can jog and do all that good stuff, and still we're going to drop dead at some point. That's not in our control to determine exactly when that's going to happen. So you didn't choose your family that you were born into. I'll come back to the New Age stuff about that. But let's just agree for the moment that probably you didn't choose your family. You didn't choose the time, the culture, the historical movement in which your world is going through. So you can imagine two sensitive children. One is born into a loving, welcoming family, and one is born into an abusive, hypercritical family. The experience each one has of their family is going to have a huge impact on their psychology. Formation of complexes, development of insecurities, so on and so forth. They didn't get a choice about that. It's what their fate was. A child born into a situation of great wealth is going to have a different life experience than one born into a situation of great poverty. A child born in the United States in the 1950s is going to have a whole different life experience than a child born in 1930 Germany. We can't even, I think, begin to imagine what life back then was like, what their fate was, and how different from us their circumstances were. So if I'm born into a time of war, or a time of upheaval, or a time of great change, it's going to affect my psychological development. It can't help but do that. Parents are going to have a huge impact, tremendous impact on the development of the psyche. For a child, for an infant, parents are gods and goddesses, and what they do wrong is going to be remembered one way or another. So, I mean, you can't help but screw up your kids, so you should all take that to heart. You're going to do something wrong somewhere along the line, but, you know, there are differences in degrees, let's say. So, again, somebody born in the time of World War II, you're a young man, you're going off to war. We know how that affected the psychology of many of the veterans. Experience of Vietnam. If you're from my generation, that had a huge impact. Huge impact on me personally, huge impact on the culture. It still has a huge impact. And we can think about, you know, more current events like 9/11, which people born after that are going to have a different experience of what freedom is than people born before it. So fate in this sense obviously is tied to time and space. The world we're born into presents us with unique challenges and crises, opportunities that are going to determine in great measure how our personality develops. So if you have, let's say, a good fate for the beginning of your life, you're in a real sense blessed. Because a good fate in the beginning of your life usually gives you the resources to deal with whatever life brings you. Whereas people who are born into a less supportive environment are going to have trouble typically dealing with crisis the rest of their lives. So why? I mean, what some people will say, of course, another argument that you could present is that there isn't any such thing really as fate. There's just accident, happenstance. You're born when you're born because that's when you were born, and that's the end of the story. That you can't really disprove such an argument. You prove that fate is some kind of a factor in our life. But I think we would all agree that it feels like that a great deal of the time. And subjectively, we view fate as something real and not just accident. If something bad happens to us, we usually get pissed off, right? You get pissed off at fate, or you get pissed off at God, or you get pissed off at whoever you're in the mood to blame for your particular circumstance. And the New Age people are on the opposite side of the coin. I mean, they're pretty old age people now, right? They've been New Age for as long as I have. So. But one of their arguments is that before you're born, you choose your family, you choose your country, you choose the circumstances into which you're being born, because you need those experiences for your development. It's not a bad idea. And of course, you can't disprove it, right? No, you didn't choose before you were born. I can't prove that to you, and you can't prove to me that you did. But especially from a Jungian perspective, the idea that the ego is in control of everything is usually not in favor. We don't look at the ego as having the task of controlling its life and controlling everything in its life. So even if we have consciousness before we're born, to me it's very unlikely that we can determine the nature of our fate ahead of time. And there are also, we're going to talk about taking fate from the perspective of meaning and trying to wed that to destiny as we go on. But it's certainly true, and I've certainly seen people in my practice whose fate has overwhelmed them. They're simply not able to make meaning out of it, at least at a certain point in their development. So, and I've seen dreams that have symbolically portrayed people born under one dream I saw, for example, that this man who had had a horrible life, at his birthday in the dream, the day of his actual birth, the sun rose, but it was black. And, you don't have to be a genius to figure out that's not good. So it seemed to me that his fate had just been an awful one for whatever reasons. And he didn't make it. I mean, he just could not cope with it because it was so overwhelming. So when we talk about meaning, we're really talking about a kind of middle ground where people have not been overwhelmed by the circumstances of their lives, but neither have they been so spoiled by good things happening all the time that they don't care about meaning. They're just having a good time. It's someplace in the middle. So if we do choose our fate before we're born, I wonder why people would choose to be born in Nazi Germany, or in some ways much worse, Stalinist Russia. I mean, these are times and cultures and places that were almost completely inhuman, at least at the top. And when we think about that, when we consider history from that perspective, when we think about millions and millions and millions of people being killed because Stalin was paranoid, one man's paranoia really created incredible havoc. It's hard to look at such things and determine if in fact they are meaningful or not. They certainly don't look meaningful. And if you were living in those times, if you were in a gulag or a concentration camp, you would be hard-pressed to find meaning. Although, of course, there were people who did it, like Viktor Frankl, who based his whole psychological theory on concentration camp experience. So if we look back at these times and think of them as heartless and cruel, imagine living through them. If you can, imagine what that would do to your life. Go back 1,000 years when, if you lived in a village, it could be raided at almost a moment's notice. Earlier, you could be enslaved at a moment's notice. You had no sense of security about family or your ongoing life. Everything depended on fate, which is, of course, one reason why people develop religious ceremonies to influence fate. I'll slaughter 12 cattle and you don't let anybody destroy my village. I don't think it worked terribly well, but who knows? So I've been a student of history since I was 7 years old. I mean, I've always loved history. And the question that constantly comes to me as I'm reading. The history of the human race is not terribly enjoyable reading. And there are some good spots, but there are not a lot of them. So when you look at that, the question of meaning, for me, becomes very important. Can you look at a historical period and decide if, in fact, there was meaning at both the individual level and at the cultural level for the experiences that they went through? So far I've talked about fate as these external forces. But there's a second dimension to fate, which is a little bit more complex, and that is the fate that determines our inner development, our psychological development. Now, as I said, all of these external experiences have a tremendous impact on our psychological development. But there is another conception of fate that earlier writers had, that who you are, your own personality, was determined by fate. And Jung discusses this in Mysterium Uniqueness, which is volume 14 of the collected works. Probably, I think, his greatest book. He's talking about a tradition that you find in alchemy, but you also find in Gnosticism earlier, and in Kabbalah, a lot of the mystical Hellenistic traditions, which is the image of ascent and descent. And what I mean by that is that from this perspective, from the perspective of these traditions, when you're born, you start way up at the top of the celestial food chain. And you're going to have to, as a soul, you're going to have to descend down until you get to our world and incarnate. And in the process, according to these traditions, you pass 7 places, which are either called the 7 planetary spheres, or in Gnosticism, they're the archons, the 7 archons. Archons are the bad guys in Gnosticism. Archons are false gods. They're gods that have revolted against the true God and taken over our world. So they have a big influence on who's born here and how we are born here. From the pure Gnostic tradition, this world is a concentration camp. We are all prisoners and we don't know it. And our only real purpose is to feed these archons. They live off of our energy. They're kind of like cosmic vampires. So it's not a terribly optimistic view of life here, but not all these traditions were so pessimistic. But again, they all had the view that you're going to start up here, you're going to work your way down, and 7 archons, starting with the big guy, moving all the way down to the less powerful god. But each stage of the way, they give you an aspect of your personality. It's either a blessing or a curse. And you have no control over what that is. We don't know if it's, in Eastern thought there would be karma involved. Your soul would be influenced by your past deeds, and so you would be born in a condition that reflected what you had achieved in your other lifetimes. Gnosticism isn't so clear about that at all. It seems much more random. So here we are, we're a nice little soul, and we're coming down, we want to be born and have a happy life, and we get cursed by archon number 4. Well, what that will mean from their perspective is psychologically, I will have a big deficiency of some kind. Complex, you could say, or psychological handicap of some kind. Might have a sexual deviancy or some such thing. All just at the whim of these gods. However, the tradition then says there's a way to escape that. And the way to escape that is you have to go back up and start all over again. But you don't want to wait till you die, because it'll be too late. You'll be in the downwards cycle again. So especially if you're a Gnostic or a mystic or a shaman or something of that sort, you're urged to cultivate this visionary practice, very much like active imagination in Jungian thought, whereby you imagine, you visualize yourself going up one by one by one by one. And at each step of the way, you give the God back what it gave to you. Blessing or curse, you give it back. So by the time you get to the top, you don't have anything left except your innate being. But then you come back down again. And this time you come back down because you have put off the gods. You have given back to them. You are considered to be superior to them. And so each step of the way when you come down, you take on their power. So by the time you're born again, at this seventh level, you are a god, essentially. In the East, they would say you're enlightened, something of that sort. But if you just consider that as an image, however difficult it is to get up to the top guy, the imagery is saying you are not trapped by your fate. There is a way past that. There is a way that you can actually undo your fate if you go into this spiritual adventure, if you make this ascent. Jung calls this view of the Western equivalent to karma. But again, we don't know for sure if the Gnostics believed that you had a past life that influenced what the gods did to you. It's not clear about that. But in any case, they're still the ones with the authority and the power. So this mystical ascent, which is also imaged in alchemy by the process called sublimatio, which sublimation comes from, it just means getting up above your normal everyday life and being able to look at it. So if you experience a sublimation process in analysis or in alchemy or whatever, it means you're starting to get a much bigger perspective on who you are, what your life is about, what your fate has meant to you. You are no longer trapped in the little ego space. So the point of all this exercise is to free yourself from fate. Jung just says that he who ascends unites the powers of above and below and shows his full power when he returns again to the earth. So again, we're not killing the gods, but we're integrating them. We're taking them into ourselves as if we were making the gods part of our personality. If you know Hillman's work, he would like that. That would be soul-making. That would be integrating the archetypes into the whole personality. So in that process, one ceases to identify with their ego personality. Doesn't mean they get rid of it. We don't want to ever get rid of it. But if you're not identified with it, you begin to see yourself as a different kind of creature. You are no longer simply a human being in the normal sense of the word that we use with it. It means, again, from the Jungian perspective, the ego has discovered the self. The ego has discovered that there is an aspect of its personality that is more than human. There's an aspect of its personality that is divine in some way. And therefore, there's an aspect of their personality that hasn't been determined by fate. Our psychological theories, mostly with Jung as the exception, are all based on determinism, right? Determinism. We are what our childhood did to us. You know, the old joke, if you're Freudian, just blame mom. You know, whatever your problem is, it's her fault. It's always looking back. It's looking back and saying, oh, your personality comes because you had this experience, that experience, and this other experience. In the 70s and 80s, behaviorism took this to a pretty radical place in saying that, well, you are who you are because you have been conditioned by certain stimuli that make you who you are. You've experienced deprivation, you've experienced love, you've experienced hardship. So if you are the sum total of everything that you have experienced, the behaviorist says, then we can change your personality by conditioning you to different stimulus. So psychological theory took the idea and said, well, we'll just kind of remake you. We'll give you good experiences. The Freudian idea of the transference being the healing mechanism is based on the idea that we have to redo your parental relationship. If I can redo your parental relationship and now I'm the good dad, not the bad dad, it will heal you. That will be the healing process and analysis. All of that is dependent on this idea that we are determined by fate. And that's the end of the story. But again, if you bring in Jung and you bring in some of these earlier traditions, what they're saying is that there's a part of you that is not determined by fate, has always been you, and will always be you. And if you can discover that part of yourself, you step into a whole different way of living and way of being. Now that's not, I would say, an absolute rule. There are people whose self, not the ego now, but the self has been injured. This man with the black sun dream, for example, his fate was so horrible that the very depths of his psyche were affected. That's not normally the case. Normally what you see with people is that they've protected that part of themselves. You may have had this dream. There's a very common archetypal dream of you open a refrigerator and there's a baby in it. Or you come to a room in your house you never knew was there before. And those are images of the self. And the self is put in the refrigerator to preserve it. Because if you exposed yourself to the self too early, fate would have a crushing influence on it. So it's normally tucked away, protected. You remember, if you've read Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, when Jung was 3, he took his number 2 figure and he buried it. He knew he couldn't live with the self at the age of 3. He had to become an ego first. So if the self is too close to the surface, it's in great danger. So typically we put it way in the back of the psyche. We just don't want to deal with it until it's safe to do so. In people who have a normal development, usually the self won't even manifest until it's safe to manifest. It's only, again, in those very dire situations that if the self is injured, you're looking at least a 20-year analysis to just get the person strong enough to start doing the real work. Because if the self is damaged, the ego is in very bad shape. Fortunately, as I said, that doesn't happen too often. Even in Christianity, we have, very early Christianity, we have the idea that fate can be undone. There was a saying among the early Christians that he who puts on Christ has put off the stars, meaning you're not determined by the astrological influences in your life. Because putting on Christ, from our perspective, psychological perspective, means that you have embraced the self in some way. And therefore, you have a possibility of escaping what fate has given you. The writings of Carlos Castaneda used to be very popular. I've taught classes with young people who have no idea who he is, which is a little disconcerting. But he had this concept of undoing your personal history. He said a sorcerer, to be a sorcerer, has to get rid of all their personal history. Can't be determined by anything that happened in your past. That's the same idea. If you can get rid of your personal history, you have a chance of discovering something different about yourself. And typically it's viewed as something magical about yourself. So that's one especially from, remember this second part of fate is what I've called more the inner aspect of fate, your personality being determined by the archons, the archetypes, whatever. And that one we can escape from. And that's what these traditions are saying. And also the determinant effects of our past we can escape from. Doesn't mean we can control fate in the future. You can be as individuated as you want to and still get sick or hit by a car or something that is outside of your control. And that's important to remember as we go. This is not about control or power. This is about how you experience life. So if I can't control whether I'm going to be sick or not, I can determine to some degree how I'm going to experience that, what I'm going to do with that. Is it going to crush me, or is it going to make me stronger? But I can't say, well, I'm individuated, I'll never get sick again. More's the pity. So the goal here is, again, the possibility of reaching that deeper aspect of your personality, the one that you really want to be, the person that you really are. So in essence, what I've been saying, if we put it in this context, is that all fate is determining is your ego personality. It has a tremendous impact on that. But it does not have a tremendous impact normally on the self, which is going to manifest regardless of time and space, regardless of the culture that you're in. How it does that's going to be affected, but that push is going to be there anyway. So this image of going up and coming down is a way of enriching the ego and the ego's experience to the point where it can start to really know the self as opposed to the person that it thought he was. So that experience teaches us new ways of perceiving. We discover attributes about ourselves we didn't know before, and talents, and sometimes, of course, shadowy things we would rather not know about ourselves, but they're just as important. So the two main aspects of fate, external and internal. The gods are determining us, and our life experience is determining us. Go beyond this is the way that individuation demands. We cannot individuate and stay in that little ego world. It's not possible. One way or another, we have to push past our own conditioned mind, which, if you've tried, you know is not easy. So again, we're not trying to, a lot of traditions will talk about you have to kill the ego so you can experience the true spiritual nature of your soul, or you can experience oneness with the universe. It's only the ego that sees evil. If you weren't an ego, floods wouldn't bother you. It's just the natural course of events. And I've never met anybody like that. I mean, I've read about them in the Hindu traditions, but I certainly haven't met anybody, and I don't think I would like them very much. It's a little bit too sublime and subtle. So we don't want to lose the ego. We want to expand the ego. We want the ego to grow. We want the ego to discover who it really is, and not who it's been told it is. And those are the times when you begin to, strip away what parents told you, or what kids in school told you, or whatever. And the more you go on that path, the more undetermined you are by those things. They're going to always affect you. There's no possibility that they wouldn't. But their influence gets smaller. Okay. But that's just the beginning, because that's taking us to destiny. And the more we experience our destiny, the more the ego expands, the less determined by our fate we are. I'm going to have to go into a little complicated material. I mean, have I lost anybody yet? This is real easy, right? All right. We're talking a lot about time and space as being these determinative, or at least being the container in which fate manifests itself. So that brings us to the whole issue of time, especially time viewed not from our Western tradition, but by older traditions. In the West, we do have both of our major, all three of the major religious traditions are historically rooted. Judaism is totally historically rooted, right? Everything that happened in the Bible happened in time and space. God came into my time and space, told me what to do, gave us the laws, and so on and so forth. The reason that Israel is so important is not because Jews lived there 1,000 years ago, but because God gave it to them. And how can anybody take what God gave to them? This all happened within history. So in Judaism itself, there's a tremendous love and respect for history. Judaism celebrates good times and awful times. The big holiday is the day that the temple was destroyed by the Romans. Horrible slaughter of people, but it's celebrated. This happened in time. This is part of the history. Christianity is historically rooted, right? Christ was born into time and space. If he wasn't born into time and space, it might as well not have happened, right? It wouldn't have happened. So God becomes human. God enters time and space in some way, and by extension is in control of time and space. So a good Christian might say there isn't any fate, it's God's will, and therefore we have to accept that and work with it. That's good. But it's still history. It's still time and space that this is occurring. Now there is heaven, of course, much more than there is in Judaism and Christianity. There is a look towards the other life, the future world. And of course, early Christianity was very much down on this world and wanted to get us to the next world. But still, because God came into time and space, number one. Number two, in Christianity, we're looking towards the second coming, right? The second coming of Christ will be the end of days, but it's going to happen in time and space. There will be an historical moment when he comes back, and things will go from there. So we have that great, maybe more than the Eastern religion. The Western religion is very much rooted in the historical moment. But in the East, they have a far greater understanding of time, because what they see as time is not just quantitative. It's 7:45 now. And that's what science tells us in the West. This is the time it is. It's all measured with heavenly stuff and all that good things. But in the East, particularly in China, they say every time has a particular quality to it. There's a time of war. There's a time of peace. If you go to the Bible, of course, it's in there, right? Ecclesiastics. Time to make war, time to make peace. But that's just a small piece of our tradition. In China, it's a huge piece. So the wise person knows what the meaning of their time is, and they adjust to it. They try to relate to it. And the reason that we use the I Ching, for example, is to determine what fate is operating right now in this moment. And then we harmonize with it. We can't control it. We can't fight it. We try to put ourselves in the right position for it. So if it says it's a time of war, we either have to fight or we have to retreat to the mountains and not fight. But we have to relate to what's happening here and now. So the importance of this, well, let me just build out one more place. The concept of time here is related to two other categories of time. One is divine time, the highest point you get to. Of course, there is no time there. There is simply being, no time. The next one is cosmic time, which is the time of the Tao, the time that rules everything. And then there's ordinary time. Ordinary time is rooted in cosmic time, which is rooted in divine timelessness. Okay? So in essence, all of life, if you study the I Ching, all of life is composed of patterns. There's 64 particular patterns that control every aspect of life. Every one of those will tell you a particular moment of life. You don't need any more, you don't need any less. But the idea there, again, is that if time is qualitative and we can relate to it, then that gives a certain kind of freedom. Now, in China, the freedom is much different than what we conceive of it as. In China, the freedom is just to be in Tao. If you're wise, you will be in harmony with the time. But in the traditions that I'm talking about, if you're wise, you'll be beyond time, because you'll be in touch with that cosmic time through your relationship to the self, both cosmic time and divine time. Now, in China, they have the same idea. If you become a perfect alchemist, at the moment of your death, your body will disappear. There'll be no body left. And you will have become what's called an immortal. You will have ascended to timeless time. But what do? They all come back here and hang around and stuff. They teach, or they chase women, or they do whatever they feel like doing. But it's that paradox of being timeless within time. Jung based the whole theory of synchronicity on this concept of Tao, the Chinese idea of qualitative time. For him, synchronicity is the moment when the divine world manifests in our world, in time and space. He thought synchronicity was the creative play of God. Put a fine touch on it. So every synchronicity, there's something coming into time and space that doesn't belong there. That is part of either this cosmic time or the divine time. Well, I mean, it's not human. We would say it probably does belong there if you have this bigger perspective of life. But what synchronicity typically does is it shakes us up. It shakes us up a great deal so that we become a little bit open to seeing the timeless in time. That's all right. It's a good question. I'll tell you one. I know we're running out of how we do. Yeah, okay. I'll tell you one quick story. When I was 14, I had my first pair of glasses, which was a terribly traumatic event, of course. And one day I couldn't find them. So, being 14, I flew into a terrible panic. Looked everywhere, couldn't find them, couldn't think of where they could possibly be. And as I was racing around the house looking for these, I came into my room and I saw against the wall there an ant farm. You remember those ant farms? Well, you always order the ant farm and you got the ants in the mail. And of course, when you got them, they're all dead. At least that happened to me every time. So I went around the yard and I collect ants and stick them in there. But what I didn't know is that they would fight with each other. Because if you take them from different hives, they're not going to be happy with each other. And that fascinated me. I would watch them kill each other like gladiator games. But as I walked into the room and saw it, I was suddenly really disgusted with myself. I thought, how can I do that? I'm torturing these ants for my own viewing amusement. So I took the ant farm and I raced out to we had underground trash cans way down the end of the driveway. I raced down there, I threw it in the garbage, which had just been picked up, so it was totally empty, threw it in the garbage, and as I looked in, there were my glasses at the bottom of the trash can. And that wiped me out. That had a huge impact on me. Of course, at 14, I had no way to understand it. But I immediately intuited that taking the ant farm was the right thing to do for some reason. So it opened me wide open. I mean, I was really in a daze for a couple of days. That's what synchronicity does. We can't always understand exactly what it means necessarily, but it opens us up. It has a big impact. So the main thing about synchronicity in the context of what we're talking about is that it suggests that events unfolding in time are meaningful. What Jung did was to say synchronicity is a big force, but it's only one example of a larger force, which he called acausality. And what he meant by acausality was that things happen because they have meaning. They don't happen because they were caused to happen. Now, if you really buy into that, if you really think about that, it changes our whole perspective on life. As I said earlier, psychology in the West looks at and says everything came back from there. I can tell you exactly why you act that way because your mother didn't give you candy when you were 6 and you had a fit and your father hit you in the face and you have a father complex. That's true. But what Jung says is that experience happened because it was meaningful for your individuation process. And if you look at it that way, it didn't cause you to be some way. It's helping you to become some way. And this relates to what Jung called the finalistic approach, teleological approach. In causality, we say A caused B, caused C, caused D. In a teleological approach, we say D was led to by C, which was led to by B, which was led to by A. Didn't cause anything. But for me to get to D, I had to experience A, B, and C. Okay? So the events of my life are invitations to become myself, even the horrible ones, so long as they don't overwhelm us. And that's a big person overwhelmed by fate. There's very little you can do except to try and build them up. But if you haven't been overwhelmed and you have the consciousness to look back at your life from the teleological perspective, it can be quite fascinating. I used to do workshops where I would have people take a huge piece of paper and chart out their life story. First, all the outer events on their life chart, and then as much as they could remember, all the inner events on the life chart. And then we would see how they related. And by the end of the workshop, we would try to discover the meaning that brought together the outer and the inner events of the life. And it can be a really moving way to look at your life. So I'm neurotic because I was abused as a child, or I'm a real sensitive person and I like to work with people and help them because I was abused as a child. Again, technically we wouldn't say because I was abused as a child, but my experience of abuse and pain opened me up, made me more sensitive and able to help. So fate then, as the outer circumstances that surround and influence our life, may not be random, and they may not simply be causal. It may in fact connect to our self, capital S, in meaningful ways. This can be carried high a degree as you want. Von Franz used to say that if you were randomly walking across the yard and you stepped on an anthill and you killed 35 ants randomly, it would be meaningful to every one of those ants. Insofar as an ant can find meaning. I go back to ants a lot because of my synchronicity. So even death, even the things that we fear the most, actually could be opening us up to the experience of who we are in our own immortality. So death, even the deaths that look awful and random and happen to kids and happen to young people and unexpectedly, from this perspective, would have meaning for each one of those individuals, even after death. It would be part of the individuation process. Individuation transcends death. Whether you believe in reincarnation or just going to different places, the perspective that typically we have is that the development of the self is the work of a lifetime, of more than one lifetime. So that if you work with dying people and you look at their dreams, it's really fascinating because the dreams are never about ending. Never. I've never seen one about ending. They can be incredibly symbolic and archetypal, and you have no idea really what they're talking about. But at the same token, they say, basically, live, keep going. You have an interest, you're 97, you're sick, develop that interest anyway. Because you're going to keep going in the next life. William had that very touching experience of his wife coming back after she had died, and basically as a vision saying that she was still writing her Grail legend book, which he liked very much, of course. Whether that's concretely true or not, the meaning of it was clearly she was continuing her own development in some way. So if we can get past the fear of death a little bit, fate begins to be a little bit less oppressive to us. The worst that's going to happen is we're going to die. And if that's not so bad, what else is there to worry about too much? They could make you suffer first, I suppose. But so, how am I doing here? You ready for a break? You want to take a break? We'll go 5 more minutes, take a break. I thought I would finish this by 8, but not so. So when we talk about the self, we're talking about a very mysterious thing, which Jung defined in so many different ways that people are still fighting about it today. But the idea of the self is it's our potential totality. It is us as we could be if we developed every aspect of our being. And if we developed every aspect of our being, we would discover that we were not just an ego. We would also discover we were a self, that we had a divine nature as well as a human nature. And if you start to develop those, then again, fate has a lot less power, has a lot less control over you. So not always, right? Especially at the beginning. If you're in a culture where women are devalued, it'd be very hard for a woman to develop aggressive and, what would the word be? Assertive aspects, because it's against the culture. The fate of that woman is to be born into a culture that puts her down in those ways, elevates her in ways that are not so wonderful all the time. If she's going to escape that, she has to discover in her own personality aggression and assertiveness. If she can do that, she's past her culture. She's not quite defined by that culture anymore. It's not easy. And especially if you do it publicly, you're likely to get killed. But we all have to deal with that. We all have aspects of our personality in the self that parents didn't like, that culture didn't like, friends didn't like, and we put them away. But they always come back, especially in the second half of life. They're going to come back and say, you can't put me away anymore. You're going to have to develop me. If we do that, we're not the same person we were before we developed them. We have changed. We have grown closer to the image of the self. So all of that, those qualities that culture, family, etc. do not support, don't go away. I mean, they're still in the self. And as I said before, you might put them in the refrigerator so they don't get hurt by coming out too quickly. But at some point, the refrigerator will open, and out they come. The big cause of neurosis is when your fate and your destiny are clashing. I had a client who was a male client who was a extroverted feeling type, which is pretty rare in men. And he was born into a extroverted thinking sensation family, in which the only thing of value was if you got a degree, if you made a lot of money, if you got your letter in sports, and he couldn't do any of those things. All he could do was feel. I mean, they would always mock him for crying or for being sensitive. So naturally what he did was try to be a thinking type. And it worked for about 6 months, I guess. But what happens when you try to do that against your own nature is you become split. And that's the definition of neurosis. So we're all neurotic to one degree or another to the extent that we can't be who we are. Now, in later life, as we get older, who we are demands to be known. It really wants to come out. Unless there are special circumstances, like I said, if somebody's very injured. And there are certain people who are not meant to individuate for whatever reason. And they don't feel that pressure so much. But if you do have that potential and you are trying to relate to yourself in some way, the pressure to be yourself in the biggest sense can become almost unbearable. And if you refuse, then the shit really hits the fan. If you can't take a step that you know you need to take for your individuation, after a certain point, you're going to get neurotic. Again, you'll develop physical symptoms, you'll develop psychological symptoms. Typically, your life will be made so unbearable that you have no choice but to move in the right direction. Which is going to tell us a lot about free will later on. So the more we turn our attention to these aspects of ourselves, the more we put our attention on what's happening in the dream world, the active imagination world, or if you're a body worker in your processed body, to get the signals, to get the messages, to learn who we are. Analysis, when it really takes over, is not about healing your neurosis per se. It's not about making you a more useful member of society or whatever. It's about developing those aspects of the self that you don't know, that you haven't experienced yet. So in terms of helping the person adjust to this need to go beyond their fate, analysis plays a principal role. That really is the intent of analysis. Let's see. All this works well when you're home. Oh well. Let's see. Okay. Yeah, let's take our break, and then what I'd like to do when we come back in just a few minutes is talk about destiny and how that relates to what I've been talking about so far, and then we'll open it up to questions. Okay. Can you all hear me again? Okay, so in the break, I think I did it. Is it working? In the break, I got a couple of questions. One was, could I give experiences of life's events that might injure the self, might overwhelm the self at a point where you can't embark on a normal process of living in individuation. Again, it's fortunately fairly rare, but one big category of this would be psychosis. People who are psychotic, either from biochemistry or life's events or what have you. Very hard to get that ego stable enough to work with the self. In psychosis, there's usually some damage to the self that's occurred. To the degree the damage has occurred is the degree to which the psychosis would be more severe or less severe. The more damage to the self, the more severe the psychosis. It's not always psychosis. It can be very neurotic people who are trapped in the world of their neurosis. They're usually actually very narcissistic in some way, and everything is kind of brought into their little ego's perspective, so that they have a very hard time seeing past that or even wanting to acknowledge anything past that. And that can be caused by abuse, physical or sexual abuse, verbal abuse, if it's severe enough, especially in childhood. Can be caused by, if you're born with a handicap, if you're born looking not like you're supposed to look in the culture, then you're very often scapegoated, and that can develop into a very severe neurosis that's very hard to escape from. But it can be almost anything in your life experience that's so big that it just overwhelms every defense that you have. Now, a lot of times those same events can be the pathway to a bigger experience and a wider awareness. Person X gets cancer, and they use it as a means to individuate. Person Y gets cancer, and they freak out and go into terrible panics and travel all over the world looking for magic solutions and that kind of thing. What determines all of that, how people respond to the events of their lives, is, it's a kind of a mystery. I definitely am a believer in grace, that some people are given the opportunity that other people aren't, for whatever reasons. So again, it's anything that's so big. It's kind of like a tidal wave, or a flood, we could say. So if you use that analogy, some of you have water in your basements, right? That's a little neurosis. Some of you don't have anything, you're fairly normal. And others, the foundation was wrecked, and that's a psychosis. So the more of that foundation that gets wrecked, the less we have to build on with the person. And it's pretty tricky work. The other question was about active imagination. Really can't talk about that too much now, but if you're interested, there's a book called On Active Imagination, which is a collection of all of Jung's writings on it. It's actually a pretty thin book because he didn't write very much about it. He wanted to teach it orally. He thought you should be an analysis to do active imagination. In fact, when I graduated from Zurich, you were not permitted to teach active imagination publicly because it was the secret. And then Barbara Hanna, who was the big guru of active imagination, wrote a book on it and ruined the whole thing. So we all started teaching it. And there's a book called Inner Work by Robert Johnson, which is a really good introduction to dream work and active imagination. And then my first book, Jung and the Alchemical Imagination, is very much about active imagination, especially from the alchemical tradition. And that book, you may have noticed, I think there was only 2 copies that we had because it's out of print at the moment. But it is available in ebook form if you have a Kindle or whatever. You can get it on Amazon. Okay. The self is a paradox in a lot of different ways. In fact, one of the definitions that Jung gave to the self was a union of opposites. It's not male, it's not female, it's not hot, it's not cold, it's not human, it's not divine, it's all of them. Somehow, it unites all of those things into itself. It's conceived of as being composed of very universal properties, like archetypes. So people who begin their individuation work are usually going to wind up working on very similar things, especially same time and space, coordinates. But the paradox with the self is that it's not only universal, but it's totally and completely unique. If you really get to know yourself, you'll discover you're not like anybody else that's ever lived, which is a rather huge discovery. I had a dream once, which I loved this dream. This was many years ago. But in the dream, I was a fly, and I was buzzing around. And I came to this field, and the field was a total field of dandelions. And from my fly's perspective, the dandelions seemed like they went forever. And I buzzed into the dandelion field, and I discovered they were all singing. And they were singing in harmony. It was an incredible dream. And they were singing this most beautiful song, but it was 2 songs at once. Every dandelion was singing the dandelion song, because you're a dandelion. What else would you sing? But at the same and in harmony with the dandelion song, every dandelion, every individual dandelion was singing its own unique song. And that's the image of the self, that we're all singing the human song. If we really shared our experiences, we would have a lot in common. We would know what we meant by certain things, and so on and so forth. But we're also singing our own individual unique song. And that I can't explain to you. And you couldn't explain yours to me. But we could hear the song. And that's the important thing. So the dandelions, the dandelions are just weeds. So what that dream was saying to me, I think, was that paradox about the self, but that truth, individuality and uniqueness and universality, is true of everything. It's true of every creature, not just human beings. So there's 2 ways to move from fate to destiny, and that's to learn these 2 songs. If we can really understand what the human song is, we could sing it more consciously. Again, if you look at the history in which you're going to find this song, it's not always a pleasing kind of song. It doesn't seem as beautiful as the one in my dream, but I suspect it is in some way. But at the same time, we would all be singing that unique song. So the first stage is the universal self. Second stage is that tremendous level of uniqueness. And when we get to that place of uniqueness, we discover destiny. We are really on the track then to either transforming fate into destiny or uniting fate with destiny, however you want to conceptualize it. So, okay. I keep saying there's 2 to this and 2 to that, but there's 2 levels to destiny too. just like there is to fate. Fate, remember, is outside circumstance, but also how our personality has been forged on the inner level. In destiny, we discover two main things. Gerald Dorn was a really famous alchemist from the Middle Ages that Jung loved. It's only now slowly being translated into English. But one of the things Jung liked to quote from Dorn was, if you want to make the philosopher's stone, in other words, if you want to individuate, if you want to come to your self, you must discover not only who you are, but what you are. And I thought about that for a long time. I couldn't figure out what meant. What does it mean to discover what I am? I'm a human being. Who I am, I got a better idea about. But in recent years, it's become a little bit, I think, it's either a little bit more clear or I'm just increasingly delusional. But it's fun, delusion, so I don't have any complaints about it. Who we are means being that self, right? Finding out those, not only the collective forces that we need to integrate and understand, but the more unique ones. The more unique aspects of our own being. But what we are is the role that we play in the universe. You know, a lot of people, when you talk about that, will say, well, you know, I'm a real estate agent, or I'm an analyst, but that's not what it's about. It's not about your job. It's about your passion. It's about what really calls you. It's about who you are in terms of functioning within a universe that's united and whole. So first you know who you are. You discover something of your own aspect of the self. And then you have to give that back in some way. You have to incarnate that, create something with it. And that's what we are. And we're running out of time, so I'm just going to give you a very quick example, and then I'm going to open it up to questions. I always think I don't have enough material. And then, you know, halfway through I realized, geez, I'm not going to be able to talk about that. Tell you two stories. One is from my own life. I mentioned earlier when I was 7, I started falling in love with history. When I was 7, I began to read, and I loved reading. And I remember the first book I ever read, which was the story of Leif Erikson. I don't know if they still have the Landmark series of books, but for kids back then, they were fantastic. So I fell in love with history because I fell in love with Leif Erikson and all of his adventures and so on. So in high school, and the history teacher took me under his wing. He really trained me a lot with history, and my one goal was to be a history professor. And then all through college, same thing. Then Vietnam happened. And Vietnam, when it finally reached my little tiny college campus, upset all my plans. And for those of you who have read my first book, you know that at the same time, my senior year in college, I had a really big mystical experience. So both of those things took me way out of history. And I had started graduate school, so I quit that and got all involved in the peace movement and so on. But then I got into psychology. The peace movement led me to meditation, to spirituality, and then finally to Jung, all pretty much accidentally. Went to Zurich, did all the Jungian things, and lo and behold, when I was 40, history came back with a vengeance. I couldn't get enough of it. I couldn't read psychology anymore, yeah. But history I could read all day. And in a way, I mean, I knew that I was going back to something really important to me that I had to put away for 20 years. But the way that history came back was totally influenced by the fact that I'm a Jungian. So I don't just read history, I do active imagination with it. I meditate on it, I try to feel it, try to understand what the movements and the meanings of it are. And that has built to the point where through a really huge dream that I had, which I don't think I will share at this point, but at some point, I knew that that was my myth. I mean, that's what I really was about, was to try and work with history in an alchemical way, if you can imagine that. That history itself isn't a dead thing. It's a very much of a live thing that you can work with in a conscious way. That, for me, to just make it clear, is the what that I am. I could be who I am without doing that, but I wouldn't be whole if I didn't do that. So you put those two things together, the who, that's who we are, the what, that's what we are drawn to in a way that's passionate enough that it feels like it will survive death. So if you're truly an artist or something of that nature, you have an idea of what I'm talking about. And if you can get in touch with that, and to me, it takes a long time, a lot of work. I don't think I would ever have come back to that without having gotten very, very ill for a long time. And in that illness, which I was very pissed off about, it's like you see who works with you anymore. It freed me from patterns and I would say behavioral and ideas that were keeping me from doing what I needed to be doing. And like I said, if you have that urge to be and to become what you really are, and you don't do it, then the compensations become very intense and extreme. And sometimes you can't do it without getting sick or experiencing some kind of pain and suffering. You just can't do it. Pain is a tremendous teacher, but I don't recommend that. So at the moment that we know who we are and we know what we are, fate and destiny are coming together. I can't control what's going to happen next week, but it doesn't matter what's going to happen next week. It's not going to change who I am. Nothing's going to change who I am, because I really know who I am. And nothing's going to change what I am. It may grow, it may transform, it may continue, but it's not going to change anymore. So if you have that feeling, what happens in the outer world is much less significant. Jung used the analogy of at the beginning of individuation, you're on the ground floor. You hear all the traffic noise and all the bustle, and by the end, you're up on the penthouse. You look out your window, you see, oh yeah, there's all that traffic, but you don't hear it anymore. It doesn't affect you anymore. That's, kind of down the road. But the main point is to recognize that you don't have to be your fate. You can learn from it, and the more meaning you find in it, the more you are transforming it into your destiny. If you can do that, your destiny takes over and will teach you. It will guide you, again, through dreams and life experiences and so on. If somebody had told me where I am now 20 years ago, there would be no way I would have believed it, number one. And if I had decided to get here on my own, it would have been impossible. You have to trust enough that the fate will carry you in the direction of your destiny long enough that you can snag both of them. And I think we'll stop there, and I'll see if you have any questions. Yeah. It's I wouldn't want to be totally retired, but I like a little retirement. I tell people I'm a little retired. It's being able to age while you're in touch with your inner life gives you a totally different perspective on the aging process, which for the most part we're taught to fear and cover up as much as possible. If you're 87 years old but you're climbing Mount Everest, we say that's so great. But if you're 87 years old and you're communing with the spirits, we don't really care very much. We're probably senile. But if you follow your dreams, aging is just one more part of the individuation process. It's actually quite fun in a lot of ways. It's hard in a lot of ways, but it's quite fun too. You notice that you don't care about things you used to care about, and you don't want so many material things, and you don't get quite as angry or as upset, and at the same time, because Jung defined analysis as teaching for death. He thought a good analysis would teach you to die properly. So being able to age with that perspective in mind is quite interesting. How does one die well? I think it's you live well, you're going to die well. But so there's actually, because the analysts in my community are getting old, there's a lot of writing being done on it. It's very interesting stuff. As people who have some kind of insight into the world of dreams are trying to understand the aging process from a different perspective. So that's just a little hint. Yeah?
I thought I heard at one point before the break you were saying about developing aspects of yourself, and yet personal story, the breakthrough came when you let go of something.
Right.
Now I hold in my mind that these are contrasting approaches, and
yes.
Am I holding them as a dichotomy where, in fact, that they're a paradox?
Yeah.
One final question. You said, when you see meaning in your faith, do I need to see meaning in my faith in order to let go of its hold on me?
It helps. It helps a lot. I wouldn't say you have to, but it beats the alternative. That's a very good question, and I didn't really get to free will, which is, I think, what you're kind of asking about. What I was saying just now was that there was no way from my consciousness that I could have predicted where I am now or created the circumstances for getting here. The idea of developing the self doesn't mean that you control the self. It means that whatever's coming up, you listen to. Now, sometimes you can choose, but a lot of times you can't. So let's say a 45-year-old male, his anima comes up, and it brings up a terrible problem about feelings in his marriage and young women and all this kind of stuff. He didn't ask for that. And he might choose not to work with it. If he chooses not to work with it, he's probably going to go buy a Fiat or something, or get his secretary to, right? But if he does work with it, he is trying to develop the self, but only by listening, by trying to learn what the self is telling him. So it's a little paradoxical, but it's never about controlling the process. It's always about following the process. The only time you really want to exercise some control is if a person is in real jeopardy of losing their self to trauma or whatever. Then you might have to really intervene and get them to do some ego work. But typically individuation means following. If you read any of Arnie Medell's books, he started something called process-oriented psychology, which is all about listening to your body. In Mendel's perspective, the body's dreaming all the time. So if you get a symptom, it's trying to tell you something about your psychology or your inner world. If you can listen to that, work with it, it can help an aspect of the self develop. But you can never tell it what to be. I couldn't say to myself, I don't want to do history anymore, let's do something else, let's do English lit. It wouldn't, I don't have that power. So very quickly for me, free will doesn't exist, especially as we like to think of it in the West. Free will is about whether you're going to follow or not. You're either going to listen or you're not going to listen. And as I said earlier, if you choose not to listen, there are consequences to that. So it's conditional free will. Jung put it, if you're either going to follow your process or you're going to be dragged by it. That's the only choice we have. Now, that doesn't mean I can't choose to go to 7-Eleven on my way home and buy a carton of milk and all that good stuff. But in the ultimate existential significance, we don't really have a choice. We either be ourselves or we don't be ourselves. And the paradox of that is, if you be yourself, it's exactly what you would have chosen to do anyway, if you had had the power to know that at the time. So all the pieces in your life start to come together and you realize, wow, this is where I wanted to be. I would have chosen this if I had known it was an option. But it doesn't matter. If you choose to follow the process, you'll get to a really good place sooner or later. So develop is not in that masculine sense of taking something and working on it. And anything else? Yeah.
If you exercise your creative imagination on the current spirit of the times, the current contemporary American culture, does any period of history seem to echo more strongly than others?
Echo in what way?
Comes to you so that you can say, yes, it feels as though we may be heading towards something, or be verging towards something that is more. In my own mind, we are a combination of 1984 and the Brave New World, currently. And just in my feeling for it, I feel that post 9/11 is trending us more towards the totalitarianism.
I have no doubt about that at all. It's a totalitarianism. If you study history long enough, you do observe patterns, right? One of the main patterns that you can see, whatever culture you look at, is where there's more insecurity, there's less freedom. Where people feel secure, they're more free. And as a culture right now, we don't feel secure at all. So we're willing to give up a whole lot of freedom in order to stop the bad guys from blowing us up, which makes sense to one level, except it's probably not going to work, and it certainly doesn't solve anything. And by the end of it, if we're trending the way that I see it and what you're talking about, we'll wind up in a place much worse than terrorism itself.
So that being said, you said that a wise person in the Chinese is someone who does know the meaning of the times and knows how to adjust to it. So if we're saying that this period of time is about so much fear and therefore heading for normal.
Right.
We have to adjust.
You're facing that.
Okay. I'll repeat the question with the mic, but go ahead. She mentioned that earlier. I said in China, the wise person adjusts to the time. So if we apply that to the times that we're living in, what adjustments might we make? That's where we do have a little bit of choice. Because from the Chinese perspective, if you're a pure Taoist, they would say, become invisible. When the government is spying on its own citizens, be invisible, and they won't be able to.
The internet and not driving your car.
Or it would mean that what you present on the internet has nothing to do with who you really are. I mean, there are a lot of ways to be invisible, but it depends. It depends. You could if I was myself, most people wouldn't understand me anyway. So I'm not too worried about the government. But by the same token, if you have any fantasy that you have privacy on the internet or almost anywhere now, you're out of touch with the times. So you could adjust by saying, okay, look at me. I got nothing to hide. Read my emails. I don't care. Or you can say, screw you, I'm going to go underground. You're never going to see me again. And if you go on the internet and you Google something about that, there are people who will teach you how to be invisible on the internet. There are ways to do it. It's a lot of work. For most of us, it's probably not that relevant. But if you have things you don't want the world to know, you should be aware of the times that we live in. That would be another way of adjusting. The other thing to say is, how do we get back that feeling of security that we've lost? which is the only real way to stop this trend towards totalitarianism. I was just talking about the situation in Greece where the economy is so bad, situation is so rough that fascism has reappeared. And that's just typical. That's what happens.
But what's scary is the totalitarian.
Absolutely.
But that is what
It's totally in opposition to individuation. It's very difficult to individuate in a totalitarian state. It's one of those things that fate, again. Now, we're a long way from Stalin's Russia, but the trend is not good.
Well, I wanted to know if you had an answer to his initial question about the congruence with another period.
They're all pretty nasty in some ways. And you can start to see the patterns. But no one period is like another. There's so many different variables that are involved. All you can really do is say, well, this trend looks similar. So the trend we're in now looks to me like 1920s Germany, where having lost the war, the economy was in the toilet, people had nothing. They want security, they want a strong government. Italy, Mussolini brought order back to the streets. So we'll give up our freedom, you give us our security back. But again, you can see it, that's an archetypal pattern. I think you can see in almost any cultural period, historical period. We are different because if the Nazis had the technology we do now, can you imagine what they would have done with that? The ability to record every email and every phone call, it's just mind-boggling. And that's only the start. They've now discovered that they can, the government has the way to undo the security of all your online sites, banking, whatever. So if they want to get your records, they don't have to ask. They can break your security. So we have all the tools in place for an absolutely incredible period of totalitarianism. Whether we go that way or not will depend on a lot of choices that are made. But I see us in that pattern. With all the technology we have, it's far scarier than even 1984 made it out to be. Put it on a lighter note, yeah.
What I understood from what you said is that to discover both universality and uniqueness and who I am and what I am requires a deep observance.
Yeah.
Do you regard analysis as one of the ways to guide that observance? I know there are many spiritual traditions you need a guru.
Right.
Tell you exactly how you need to observe.
Right.
Does analysis also suggest ways of quick or
Forget quick.
way to
Yeah.
observe?
Forget quick. More productive, maybe. There's nothing quick about individuation. The difference is, in analysis, is just about listening. It really is about listening. When Jung was discovering active imagination, his inner teacher said to him, you have to look at every thought as if it were a deer in the forest. You didn't make up that deer, you have to observe that deer. And that taught Jung what Buddhists know, that you can watch your own mind and not get attached to it as it's doing what it does. But it's all about listening. So my job as an analyst is to listen to the client and what their dreams are telling them. I never assume I know what's right for them, because that would be to step into power and also would cloud their uniqueness. But their dreams know. So if I can listen to their dreams and they get to the point where they're listening to their dreams, then that observation takes them both to the universal and the unique. Yeah.
In your story, something that you loved when you were very young child came back,
Yeah.
and that had very much to do with your path towards individuation itself. So the question is, how typical do you find that in your experience with being an understanding that? Is that fairly typical that people really discover, begin to discover who they are with a capital W or what when they're quite young, and then somehow they get lost along the way?
Yeah, I don't know. I hesitate to say typical or not typical, but I've seen it, certainly in my clients. Not all of them, but... And that's why we're very interested in childhood dreams, because a lot of times the dreams you have as a child will paint your whole life and will give you a lot of insight into the who and the what that you're becoming. But yeah, that's why, I mentioned earlier we do the life chart and then the inner life chart. And going back to childhood, people could see things that were happening that they might not have been aware of, but that was very much in line with what happened 40 years later or 10 years later. So I think it's all there. What tends to happen is we ignore it because, peer pressure or pleasing our parents or whatever. But typically it'll come back. It will. Anybody else? I think it's probably getting late. All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.